Good evening. I'm Bruce Putterman, publisher of the Connecticut Mirror. Thanks for joining us for this second in a three-part series previewing the 2021 Connecticut legislative session. Last week, Mark Pasniokis, Jenna Carlesso, and Kasturi Pananjati joined us to talk about how this session is going to be quite different from any other legislative session due to the pandemic. They also talked about healthcare coverage in depth and COVID in particular. In 2 weeks, Keith Phaneuf is going to join us. He's going to talk about the state budget in depth. And tonight, Connecticut Mirror reporters Jacqueline Rabe Thomas, Kelan Lyons, and Adria Watson join host John Dankosky to talk about housing, education, and justice. Thanks to your financial support and commitment to the Connecticut Mirror, you publish the most trusted news for public policy in Connecticut. You hold government accountable. You tell stories that no one else is telling. And you make events like this possible. This series of events is also made possible in part by financial support from the Connecticut Business and Industry Association, or CBIA. Before we get started with John, we've invited CBIA to share some of their reflections on public policy in this upcoming legislative session. It'll take 90 seconds, and after that, we will get started with the program. So thanks for joining and enjoy the show.
In times like these, we feel gratitude for coming together during an extraordinary crisis, showing that tough times bring out our best. Rebuilding Connecticut together. A message from CBIA.
Investment in infrastructure, tax relief, taxpayer ROI, and workforce development are critical to manufacturers and to the business community in Connecticut.
Our businesses need to know that we will join them to fight back in promoting a climate that will rebuild Connecticut and grow jobs.
I signed the Rebuilding CT Pledge because I've lived here for 43 years. I know what a great state we have.
We need terrific workforce development programs. We need strong infrastructure improvement, and we absolutely need relief for small businesses.
Our organization sits on the junction of education, entertainment, and tourism, and each of these industries will be critical to rebuilding Connecticut.
Connecticut is a great state, but together we can make it much better.
We must hold our elected officials accountable.
It's so important to have a concise, direct platform that explains what's so important to the business community.
So in the words of Helen Keller, alone we can do so little, together we can do so much.
We encourage you to sign on to the pledge. And on behalf of the Waterbury Regional Chamber, we appreciate the opportunity to join you in this effort.
Hi, I'm John Dankosky. I'm the host of the Connecticut Mirror, and I'm looking forward to this conversation with Adria Watson, Kelan Lyons, and Jacqueline Rabe Thomas. We'll bring them on in just one moment. We're going to get to as many of your questions as well as we can, as we've done with events like this in the past. There's a Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. You've probably done a Zoom meeting before, so you're used to this sort of thing. You can type in your questions in the Q&A, and I will try to get to just as many of them as is possible by the end of our program. Last week, lawmakers opened up the session outside because of COVID, and only a few hours later, they watched as a violent mob stormed the Capitol in Washington. Now, that's prompted increased security at Capitol buildings around the nation. It's forced the legislature to adjust its schedule the next few weeks. And of course, we've all had to adjust our schedule so much over the course of this last year. So as we get started talking with our Connecticut Mirror reporters, we will be talking quite a bit about how COVID has affected their lives and their beats. But first of all, I want to welcome in Jacqueline Rabe Thomas and Kelan Lyons, Adria Watson. Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for being here.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Hello.
And before I get to maybe some of the big topics that are happening on your beats, Jackie, I'll start with you. You've covered legislative sessions quite a bit. How is this going to be different in this age of COVID and with all the overlay of what happened in Washington, some of the concerns of what's happening at capitals around the country?
So the legislative session is going to be different. Everything will be online for the most part, which makes our lives as reporters a lot more difficult to track down. Legislators have sort of those conversations of just sort of, hey, what did you mean by this comment? Or, just have those follow-up questions that reporters naturally have. But I think it's also going to be a lot more difficult for reporters to find people who are in the room who this directly impacts. There's nothing like going to a legislative hearing and looking around to see, the residents that are there, the people who are actually impacted by these policies. We're not going to necessarily have those opportunities this legislative session. So we're going to have to work a little bit harder to get those voices into our stories.
Yeah, Kellen, from your standpoint, I mean, how do you think that this is going to change both the way that you're covering the legislature, but also maybe the way in which the legislature and some of the different departments that you cover are actually working right now?
Well, I think it's going to be a lot more of the same from over the summer, in that we're going to be spending most of our time in front of our computers and on Zoom calls, unfortunately. And like Jackie said, there's something that's a little lost in that, but I think that the Connecticut Mirror's reporters are quite well sourced on each of our beats and have a lot of subject level knowledge. So I think we'll be relying on those relationships with sources more than ever to make sure that we understand, the proposed bills and we can connect with folks who have lived experience who would be affected by these proposals.
And Adria, this is your first Connecticut legislative session, so you don't really have anything to compare it to, but I can't imagine that this is exactly the way they drew it up when it came to learning how to cover a state capitol.
Yeah. Yeah. I like you said, this, I don't really know what to compare it to. I have had, experience covering the California legislature. So it is kind of a shame that, the pandemic happened and I now out in Connecticut and don't really get to see like in person how this all is going to operate. But like both Jackie and Kellen said, we're well sourced here, and I think it'll be smooth. I think it'll go okay.
One thing I want to ask you about quickly, Adrian, before we get into some of the things that are coming up in the legislature, you had a really interesting story this week about how teachers in the state are adapting very quickly to teaching around the Washington Riot. And I'm just wondering if you can talk about that story a little bit, because I think it's so important. Teachers have had to adjust what they do so much in the classroom over this year, and we'll be talking more about that throughout the course of this hour. But this is just an instance where teachers who are already dealing with a pandemic are now trying to struggle to deal with something that is essentially history happening right before their eyes.
Yeah, and a part of my approach to that story too, initially was wanting to go and try to find these social studies teachers who do have that knowledge, and they teach history, they teach these classes where they can take into context, what's happened in the past and like bring that up to their students. But as I was talking to the social studies teachers, I realized, branching out and talking to teachers who teach other subjects too would be as important, because they even brought up themselves that it's a complicated topic to have with students, but their main thing is that they just wanted to make sure that students came in and had a space to ask those questions and to voice any kind of concerns that they had or fears, or just have been able to like kind of dissect and process what was going on. And that was from the conversations I had with multiple teachers last week. That was the main thing that they want to take away, is just that, to give students that space. And even as early as kindergartners, as you can see in the story, Rochelle Brown, who teaches kindergarten, she even mentioned that, her students came in, kids as young as 5 and 4 years old see their parents watching the news, and they're going to come to school and ask their teachers, hey, did you see what happened? And, she had to think about how to explain this to them, or not necessarily explain, but talk to engage, have this conversation with them and answer their questions in a way that they'll be able to digest it. So yeah, it's definitely something that, they just wanted to make sure that students just have that space and they were able to answer their questions. And the most important thing for a lot of them too was to be honest about what was happening and not, sugarcoat anything with the students.
If you haven't got a chance to see it, check out Adria's story at ctmirror.org. And Kellen, quickly on your beat, the events of the last week, I can only imagine have made people think a little bit differently, even in a year in which we've been talking about justice issues so very much. The fact that we literally had a mob, a riot, an insurrection at the nation's capital must be getting some people around your beat thinking slightly differently about issues of justice in only the last week or so. And maybe you as a reporter thinking about it differently too.
It has been quite a year for justice issues, to say the least. From the protests over the demonstrations over George Floyd's death over the summer to, the insurrection in DC and some of I wrote a story a week or so ago that was, I don't want to say it was contrasting or making the point that this mob that descended upon the Capitol, that pure chaos, and the way that those folks were treated relative to Black Lives Matter protesters and demonstrators, throughout the country in DC, but also in Connecticut, it was a very, very different police response. So, I think that Connecticut has been a state that has had a lot of thoughtful reflection on justice issues over the years under the prior governor's administration. And I think that that's only going to continue in this session as well. And as it started right before the pandemic shortened the last one.
So we'll be getting into some of those issues in just a little bit. Obviously, COVID, the pandemic, is an overlay over everything that we're talking about, and the issues that are happening in Washington right now, certainly as well. Jackie, let's turn to one of your beats. And one of your main beats throughout the course of the last couple of years has been housing. And I know that that's going to be an issue coming up once again this legislative session. I'm wondering if you can tell our listeners how exactly you're planning to approach this housing issue and how you think lawmakers are going to be approaching it this legislative session after so much discussion during the course of 2020.
So there's really two different housing issues facing the state right now. There's the immediate and the aftermath that COVID, or not aftermath, but the impact that COVID is having on people, and the economic downturn that has followed and coupled with the pandemic and people's abilities to pay their rent, pay their mortgages. Connecticut has one of the highest rates of people who are behind on their mortgages. So there's a potential foreclosure crisis coming in the state of Connecticut, as well as evictions are a huge problem right now, or people facing evictions are a huge problem right now. There's been several carve-outs that have been given in executive orders to allow for some evictions to move forward. And so you see, as those carve-outs happen, you see an uptick in more people facing eviction. There has been a rental assistance program that was set up. It took months for people to start getting funding through that. I would add that there was $40 million set aside for that. They only ended up spending about $27 million, and $13 million is going to go unspent that they initially promised for that program, just because they couldn't get it ramped up fast enough. And
I'll just stop quickly and say, in that $40 million, as you and I have talked about before, woefully short of what's actually needed. So not even those dollars being spent, and the $40 million, had it been spent, is far short of what was needed for the state.
Right. So housing advocates will tell you that it approached $250 to $300 million that was needed, that's months ago. So we're now 10 months into the pandemic of people and still record high unemployment rates. So Congress did pass some emergency rental assistance program. There's about $237 million that is headed for the state. But the state Department of Housing has taken the approach that they're going to start a new program to do rental assistance. And so here we go again are they going to be able to ramp this up faster than they did the last time around? They're not going to just make amendments to the existing program. So all those people who were in queue who had turned in the paperwork, they're not going to get the aid through that program. They're now going to have to go through this separate program that the Department of Housing is telling people will take 2 to 3 weeks to ramp up, to which housing advocates laugh and think that's not a reasonable expectation given how long it took them to launch the last program. And so what that means is the eviction moratorium, what protections there are in place to save people from being evicted. It means that the February 9th deadline of that moratorium being lifted is even more important. And whether or not people will be shielded from evictions, and whether landlords will start to see some rental assistance as well from their tenants.
So, yeah, and before we move on to some of your other housing issues, what is the expectation that the legislature, given the timing of this and given this cliff that we're talking about, that they're going to try to act sometime early on in this legislative session to do something about it?
So the Speaker of the House, Matt Ritter, this morning told members of COST, the Council of Small Towns, this morning that we're going to need the governor to extend the executive authority powers. So they're already looking at getting more time to really negotiate something for a housing omnibus bill or some sort of fix, as well as extending the governor's other executive authorities under the public health emergency. The speaker did say that, we're not talking about doing this forever, but it's just not realistic to think we're going to get everything done by February 9th.
Moving on to some of the other housing issues, you said that that's one big piece of it, how the state is reacting to the COVID crisis, the eviction crisis, the foreclosure crisis that we're having because of the economic downturn. The other big piece of this is just housing equity, something that you've been covering for years and something that advocates are wanting to bring to the front. An awful lot of people at the state legislature, were you able to see them in the hallways, Jackie, would tend to go scurrying in the other direction if you were coming after them, asking them questions about zoning reform or housing reform. So where do you think it stands this time around in a session in which you're not going to have those hallway meetings? You're not going to have advocates maybe banging on their doors at the state capitol every day?
Are you telling me people don't like to talk about zoning as much as I do?
Well, I might be saying that.
Yeah. So, the Democratic caucus is very divided on zoning reforms. On one side, you have urban legislators who say, we need to focus our time and energy and political capital on improving Hartford, on improving Waterbury, on our urban centers, and focus the energy and attention there. And then you also have suburban Democrats who live in some towns that do have restrictive zoning, who aren't super interested in changing the so-called character of their towns. And so sort of getting a coalition among Democrats who control both chambers and have for 23 years is really difficult. Enter why we are in where we are right now. Connecticut is by many measures one of the most segregated places in the country, both in housing and in our schools. We also have some of the largest home ownership rate gaps between different populations. So while some are celebrating the hot housing market that's happening right now, others are saying it's trapping people out of being able to enter the housing market.
Yeah, when you talk about that hot housing market, you see it in different pockets of the state. You see it in the cities and you see it in suburbs. You see it out in the rural areas where I live. People coming from other states, coming from the cities of Boston and New York, wanting to settle in Connecticut. And people say, wow, that's great. My house is something I can sell right now. The problem is that doesn't necessarily help the problem of affordable housing that is plaguing so many places in the state.
Right. So there's these reports that real estate groups put out that show sort of a rundown of how many listings there were, what the sales were, and sale prices are up 15% from December compared to the previous 1 year ago. So housing prices are up, and that's largely driven by just not as many houses are on the market. So it's not that we have as many houses still for sale. It's a matter of we don't have enough houses for people to look at. So when you have this influx of people looking for houses to buy, you don't have the stock necessary to supply that. So it's just simple supply and demand driving up costs for people. And what that means is that people are quickly priced out of being able to afford their first home.
I want to get back to you in just a little bit, Jackie, because as we talk with Adria about some of the education issues, local control over taxes, local control over zoning, this all gets ramped back into education policy as well. So we'll return to that. Kelan, I want to turn to you a little bit and ask, first of all, because as you said at the front, it was a huge year for justice issues in 2020, and there's an awful lot on the plate right now at the legislature. What are the 2 or 3 big issues that you think lawmakers are going to be tackling early on in this session?
I think broadly, the topics that I'm watching the most of have to do with reentry efforts as well as justice reinvestment. Connecticut has made a lot of criminal justice reforms in recent years, and the prison population has been dropping. It has fallen even faster during the pandemic. There are 3,283 fewer people who are locked up today than there were on March 1st at the onset of the pandemic. There's a lot of interest in trying to put money in toward front end supports. By which I mean housing supports, employment supports, things that make it so that folks are less likely to wind up incarcerated in the first place. So there are these root causes of crime, addressing these root causes of crime. One of the biggest things that I expect to see get some traction early on and throughout the session is something called Clean Slate. This was raised in the last session. It would automate the pardon process for individuals who remain conviction-free for a certain number of years. I would expect fights to play out over this, in terms of carve-outs and in terms of whether or not we're going to get a pure clean slate bill or who's going to be eligible, who isn't going to be eligible. But this would be a real way to try to help folks when they get out of prison to ensure that their criminal conviction doesn't follow them around if they remain conviction free. I also think that there will be some housing stuff intersecting into Jackie's world a little bit that would prohibit landlords from denying prospective tenants an apartment solely based on their criminal conviction. And all of this stuff is it revolves around equity, just given the disparities that exist within the justice system. The incarcerated population, the racial disparities in there have actually gotten a little bit worse during the course of the pandemic. I think Black and Hispanic folks make up about 72% of those who are locked up right now. At the beginning of the pandemic, they made up 70%. And I think combined, the last that I checked, they made up about 29% of the state's overall population. So they're vastly overrepresented in the incarcerated population as a whole. Justice reinvestment, when I say that, I'm referring more to taking money out of the punishment end of the system and putting it more toward the front end of the system again. So the new Department of Correctional Commissioner, Angel Quiros, he said in his appointments a couple months ago that he was interested in closing a facility or two as the state's in this fiscal crisis. I would expect there to be fights to try to take that money and make sure that it doesn't just go into the general fund and that it actually goes toward housing supports and such, so that incarcerated folks are able to, when they get out of prison, they don't wind up going back. Those are the big themes that I expect to see play out throughout the session and at the beginning.
Yeah, so when you talk about reinvestment of dollars that are currently put into prison, the hope is that they're getting some of these front end services, but the concern is, like almost everything else that's ever happened in Connecticut politics, that these dollars are just going to flow back into a general fund, help to plug a hole somewhere. What do we know about legislative safeguards to make sure that if indeed you close a facility and you save some money, that's going back where it's supposed to go?
Well, I think one of the big hangups is going to be that most of the cost to a facility actually goes to staff. So, and that money is not going to go anywhere. So I'm not sure what's going to wind up happening, but I do know that as far as this discussion around cannabis legalization, marijuana legalization, there is discussion as far as justice reinvestment goes on that end as well, to make sure that the money that comes out of that does not just go to the general fund, and that does go to communities that have been disproportionately harmed by the war on drugs.
And what does that mean exactly? When you say communities that have been harmed by the war on drugs, I know when Massachusetts legalized, one of the provisions they built in is that a certain amount of the legal marijuana business would be given to communities that have had less investment over the years. It would be going to people of color primarily who are the owners of these businesses. And as we found, Massachusetts didn't exactly follow through on some of that. It was hard to ramp up some of those programs. What exactly, Kelan, are they looking at in terms of that investment if marijuana dollars come back to the state?
I think we're really early days on this so far, so it's tough to really say with any degree of certainty. But I think you could try to see some of the same stuff. I mean, making sure that the money is going toward the cities that are under-resourced and perhaps over-policed. And that's probably the most detail that we can get as of right now. And perhaps making sure that individuals who have convictions can get those pardoned, which again would go into the clean slate principles as well, and maybe even allowing those folks to, maybe letting them get a bite at the apple as far as joining the industries if they get pardoned and those convictions aren't following them around. But we're really early days in, so I don't think there's any hard details quite yet.
Carlisle asked the question, what hope do you have for a clean slate bill? And you mentioned this before, Kelan. Just quickly, maybe you could explain a little bit in more detail what exactly the clean slate legislation is, because we had a couple different versions that were bandied about during the last legislative session.
Sure. So the clean slate bill would essentially automate the pardon process that exists right now. As of right now, folks can apply for a pardon after 3 or 5 years, depending on their crime. But it can be a difficult process to navigate. It's a lot of paperwork. You have to have a pretty extensive memory of the crime. It can be hard to get them from time to time. And also, oftentimes you have to hire a lawyer to be able to navigate this maze of paperwork. And, that's not ideal. This automated process would automatically clear that after a certain period of time has passed. There's a lot of movement around this. This interfaith organization called Connect, which was advocating for the bill a lot last year before the pandemic ended the session, they held a Zoom call last night, and there was like 900 or 1,000 people on it. They're quite organized. There's a lot of movement on it. As far as optimistic, I know it's going to be one of the most prioritized bills of the session, at least as far as the Judiciary Committee is concerned. It seems as though it's kind of anyone's guess as to what the session is going to, how hard it's going to be to get bills across the session or not. But I would say that of the bills in the Judiciary Committee, which is quite an active committee, this is going to be at the top of their priority list as well.
Yeah, and Jackie, I might just ask you very quickly, as a veteran of some of these Connecticut legislative sessions over the years, what we heard last week from your colleagues was the expectation is, because of the way that the work is being done, that we will just see fewer bills. Is that what you're expecting as well?
Yeah, I think there's an inertia that comes with going online and not being able to sort of have the quick side conversations probably in the building to sort of hash out maybe some concerns that legislators may have, or being able to track down the lobbyists really quickly to sort of get their feedback on something, or the various organizations that are impacted by legislation. So yeah, I think there's, for lack of a better word, because I know it has some negative connotations, sort of these aircraft carrier bills, sort of these omnibus bills that are going to be, I think, more the norm for things going forward.
So, and Kelan, I want to get back to a couple of those issues with you in a minute, but Adria, let's talk a little bit about what you're looking at on the education beat during this legislative session. Obviously, as I mentioned before, so much of what happens in education happens at the local level here in Connecticut. This year has been so unlike any other as far as schooling. Maybe we can start here. I mean, as you talk to teachers, superintendents, other people at the Capitol as well, what is the expectation of what school is going to look like over the course of the next year? And how do you think lawmakers are going to be trying to tackle the issue of K through 12 education when we're not exactly sure what even school is going to be?
Right. I think that, with the pandemic, we saw that it shed a lot of light on inequities in education. We saw at the beginning of the pandemic in the spring, there be an issue with students not having devices. And then later on, we see now, given that the state has launched this database, that, their students with higher needs are attending school fewer days than students who don't have higher needs. So these are students like English learners, these are low income students, these are students who are experiencing homelessness. And I think that one of the priorities that we're gonna see is just trying to get those students engaged in a response into that disengagement that we've seen happen in the last year in schools. So I know one of the priorities that the Education Committee has coming into the session is they're looking at providing resources and putting resources in place to help make up for the lost education in classrooms, since a lot of students are going to be behind academically. Earlier today, during the Board of Ed meeting, the State Department of Education also started talking about how, the funding that they're getting, this funding that they're getting from the federal government, how they're in the middle of figuring out how to allocate that to districts. But some of the priorities with the funding is putting it to remedial resources and trying to, get students back on track. So I think that those are some of the priorities. And when we're looking at remote learning, remote learning or hybrid or in-person learning with these schools, I think that it's going to be similar to what we've seen in the last few months. It's just going to depend on what cases look like, and it's going to remain so far it's going to remain locally. And some of the conversations I've had with lawmakers is, they're standing by that reopening and closing decisions being left up to the district leaders. But I think we're already starting to see that there could be more legislation that gets proposed this session that's kind of a response to how remote learning has been handled at the state level. I know earlier today, Representatives Kathleen McCarty and Vincent Candelora proposed legislation that would provide a minimum requirement for remote learning that would be applied to all districts. So we're already starting to see legislation kind of in response to how the state handles things and trying to set up requirements. But so far the conversation has been, I think we'll just, keep an eye out on how that changes throughout the session. If there's going to be more legislators that want to propose legislation that's going to add more requirements for districts to follow.
Jackie, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I would just add that the additional money heading for Connecticut from the federal government, if there was a lesson learned from the last recession and economic downturn, that the state used that money to help close its deficits. It used the money to prop up the state's primary education cost sharing formula by about $270 million. So instead of state funding going to level fund and hold districts harmless from state cuts, they use that money to they use the federal money to sort of supplement that, which meant that there wasn't additional aid going to those districts necessarily. It was going to close state deficits. Why is that important? Because the most recent bill that Congress passed does not provide additional aid to municipalities or to the state for sort of general fund uses. So that's sort of one of the big things that I'm keeping an eye out for, because that's what the last recession taught us. And what that meant is there were huge cuts in the reductions of teaching staff, just because costs go up. The costs to keep schools running go up naturally. And so, but state education aid did not follow suit. And so what happened is there was about 1,200 educators, mostly teachers, who were teaching positions, a decline in teaching positions during the last recession. So I think that's sort of something that I'm keeping my eye out on.
Yeah, and this is something, Adria, you've been working on. There's a shortage of teachers, and then you have the teachers who are teaching in the state right now, who in many cases are at odds with their school districts about whether or not they should be teaching in person, how they should be teaching remotely or in a hybrid model, whether or not they have the training to do that. Maybe you can just talk about some of those complications right now, because that sets the groundwork for not just what's happening in this legislative session, but what's happening for this entire year of 2021, how teachers are faring as they are teaching in this new world.
Yeah, so what we've seen in the last, I've been here, what I've seen since starting in August and talking to teachers, it's that there's this fear that comes with, coming to teach in person and not really knowing, and just kind of being anxious about that, and not really knowing if there's what's going to happen if they're in person in school, and possibly could contract the virus. I know that for the last few months, the teachers unions have been trying to, get the state to look at closing schools, having a say in closing schools for a few weeks after kids have come back from break. So at the beginning of the school year, it was kids were coming back from summer vacation, schools were starting to reopen, and the teachers unions wanted the state to close schools for a few weeks so that they felt sure that schools were completely safe to come back into. But it still remains, and we've heard Governor Lamont and Commissioner Cardona for the last few months, reiterate that this is the district leaders know their communities best, and they know, and they feel like they are the best decision makers when it comes to whether or not their school should reopen or close. And even recently, we've seen that happen again, where the teachers unions coming back from the winter break, they again are asking the state to close schools for a few weeks so that they feel sure that schools are completely safe to return to. But again, it's left locally. So, and I know in the teacher shortage story that I worked on, another thing that came up is what are the options for teachers who have families. One of the, some of the conversation that was focused on throughout that story was, you know, you are a teacher who's teaching in one district and your kids are going to school in another district. And if your kids are going to school in one district where they're remote and you have to go in person, then how do you balance that? And, you know, in that story, the teachers worked closely with their superintendents to figure out something that worked for them. But I think that teachers want to see more resources for situations that are like that, as well as protections for teachers who don't have underlying conditions and can't really, you know, call out or opt into working remotely.
Yeah. And Jackie, very quickly, we're getting a question here from Ev, and this goes to something that Adria was talking about just a moment ago, whether or not Connecticut students actually have everything that they need to learn in this way. The question is, some communities don't have broadband coverage to support remote learning. And that's a really important piece of this. I know that the Lamont administration, with some private help, said that they got more devices into the hands of more students. But Jackie, you've been covering these gaps for quite some time. I can only imagine that the technology gap has exacerbated the overall education gap in the state.
Right. So as far as getting students connected, the Lamont administration, about a month before the school year started, decided to allocate some of the funding that it received from the CARES Act back in March to purchase computers for students and wireless hotspots and pay for 12 months subscription to get kids connected and their families connected. How the state went about doing that is they asked every single school district superintendent to say, hey, survey your students in your district and find out how many devices we need to get for students and how many connections we need to get for students. And so every request that came in, the state funded. Does that mean that some students fell through the cracks? Yeah, I've heard from those students saying like, hey, I didn't get my laptop, or hey, I didn't get that connection. I think there's also some concern about the ability to get connected to the internet because of past due bills that someone might have with their carrier. I'm told that shouldn't be an issue, that it won't be forgiven, but it will just not be a reason that they won't get connected. But still, there are barriers that remain to getting students connected. But you know, there's also there's a lot of homeless kids in Connecticut, and you know, it's hard to sign on remotely if you don't have a home, if you're trying to sign on through a shelter or in a motel, or same thing for students who, you know, their grandma's watching them during the day so their mom can work, or their siblings watching them during the day so they can work. It's hard for those children to necessarily get connected. And the numbers show that, and the state has done a really good job of showing how much students are in fact logging on. You know, before the pandemic, it was homeless children were missing about 1 out of every 13 days. Now they're missing 1 out of every 4 days. You know, the numbers are similarly depressing and skyrocketing for other vulnerable populations as well. So I think Connecticut may have closed the digital divide in as far as getting laptops in the hands of every student that district administrators said needed them. But there's several other factors that are still preventing students from showing up to online class.
Kelan, I want to go back to you as we're talking about vulnerable populations. I know that you've been covering the call by many advocates to get more people out of prisons because of COVID. We've had a number of people die in detention facilities in the state because of COVID. It's clear that our problems in our prisons and jails aren't at the level of some other states, but that does not mean that it is good by any stretch of the imagination. I had a talk with Greg Gonzalez on our podcast, Steady Habits. He's a Yale epidemiologist. And this is something that he's been very passionate about. He says that the Lamont administration has not done a good job decarcerating and getting enough people out of prisons during this very difficult time. I wanted to ask you in the context of the upcoming legislative session, because one of the things that the governor's office told me is, look, we don't necessarily have the supports in the community for all the people who we might let out. And you were talking earlier about reentry efforts and investments in the sorts of supports that people would need as they were released from prison. Where do you think some of that stands in the context of COVID and really needing to get even more people out of prison?
Well, just to give a brief overview of that tension and that fight, there's a lot of talk about discretionary releases versus end of sentence releases. When somebody is released before the hard end of their sentence is a discretionary release. So the most commonly known of that is something called parole. But there's all kinds of different mechanisms that folks can get. What the advocates are saying, essentially what it comes down to is the heads of the criminal justice agency, state actors they see sort of a different denominator, the number of folks who are eligible for release, than advocates do. Advocates say that this is an extraordinary time, extraordinary circumstances. The governor has almost limitless power here. He can change statutes as he sees fit to allow more folks to be released from prisons or jails. He can charge different agencies to communicate so that those other front end supports are there as well. State actors, meanwhile, say we can't just release people in mass releases aren't happening. That would be pandemonium, et cetera. I do think that this is one of the bigger discussions at the Capitol this session. And I think it really figures into this idea of justice reinvestment to try to get more supports to basically address root causes of crime, more mental health support, everything from more mental health supports in communities, more beds in communities, to a better ability to secure housing or a job. I think that's going to be probably one of the biggest fights of the session. And also, I think it's a natural development in terms of the justice reforms that Connecticut has had. I mean, they've instituted a lot of reforms to keep folks out of the system in the first place, and now we're thinking about folks on the back end of the system to try to make sure that when they get out, they're not going to end up going back in because they have what they need to live, healthy, content lives.
Oh, we have a lot of questions coming in from the people who are watching, and thank you so much for joining us on Zoom. If you're joining us a little late, there's a Q&A function at the bottom, and you can type your question in there. We're going to try to get to as many as we can. Kelan, while I have you, there was an anonymous attendee who asked, do you think we'll have any bills related to the Whiting Forensic Hospital? It's a facility you write an awful lot about. Maybe you can just give people who don't follow this every day a thumbnail sketch of what the issues are at Whiting.
Yes, thank you for asking that, anonymous person. I've been following the Whiting Task Force ever since I started about 1.5 years or so ago, and they are kind of concluding their work right now. They're sending some proposals over to the legislature. One of the biggest things that they have sending over is this idea that lawmakers should start preparing for a new building. So Whiting is a facility that it's a maximum security psychiatric hospital. It's the only in the state. It deals with a lot of folks who have serious mental health conditions, a lot of whose lives become intersected with the criminal justice system. It houses the folks who are found not guilty by reason of insanity and committed to the jurisdiction of the Psychiatric Security Review Board. It also holds some folks for involuntary civil commitment. And so it also holds folks who are there for competency restoration, who need to essentially be restored to mental competency so they can go back and have their criminal cases adjudicated. The building is an interesting development because it's in some ways it's sort of a symbolic gesture to try to get the patients out of this embattled, I believe 50-year-old building in Middletown and move them to another facility. But it's also the exercise that the task force is suggesting seems like they're also kind of testing who belongs in that facility, because they're really asking them to reevaluate how many beds do you really need in this facility? Are there any of these populations you can take out so that they don't have to go to a place like Whiting Forensic Hospital, and that they can be made perhaps treated in the community? Some other things that I'm watching involving Whiting is there's some movement and discussion around retooling or reforming the Psychiatric Security Review Board, which has a sole mandate of public safety at the moment, and perhaps they could retool its mandate so that it also takes into account patient care and that they can be treated in the least restrictive setting in the community. There's also some movement to try to increase our awareness of data and public reporting of race and ethnicity and language data associated with civil commitment, forced medication, forced electroconvulsive therapy, restraint and seclusion. And then there's also some attempts to bring the Patient Bill of Rights closer to modern times and broaden communications options for patients who are inside those facilities, so that they can use cell phones and access to a computer, and they can email loved ones and such. And that's not just whiting, but it would affect whiting.
Let's turn to another question here. This one's for Adria, and Bob is asking, Adria in her article mentioned the teacher shortage being partly a function of teacher prep programs. Has the state made moves to address this shortage?
So from what we have, so there's been a few things there. I know that there's the governor not a few months ago, signed an executive order that's essentially, would allow districts to bypass the Department of Ed to bring in substitutes. We've seen in the same story, we kind of talked about how that has helped districts. It has helped districts bring in high school students who have graduated recently and wanted to come in and help. So that's one of the ways. And I know that the state has also, with the teacher prep programs, have put like an emphasis on trying to get the ball rolling on that and getting people in there, and having that prep start with, the local high schools, and having that pipeline with the state universities too, with getting, high schoolers, with one of the programs, like getting them familiar with high schoolers who are interested in teaching and starting them, in high school, but then moving forward and continuing that pipeline, going off to one of the state universities. So that's one of the examples. And then I feel like I'm missing one. Jackie, do you want to chime in on that too?
Sure. The state also provided flexibility to repurpose teachers to, if you have a music teacher, to allow them to be a kindergarten teacher temporarily. So sort of have broader parameters surrounding what teachers can actually teach in your building. So you have more flexibility. So you don't have them sort of in these silos of what teachers are in fact able to teach.
Another quick education question. Will asks, have you heard anything about extending the school year or increasing the hiring for summer school education? Oh God, we're already talking about extending the school year. So have we heard anything about this?
I have not heard anything about that, but that's definitely something that I think, I will keep an eye out on, and it's an important question to raise, especially since earlier, like I mentioned, there's these conversations happening about how to make up for lost education. So I can definitely ask about that.
I can chime in on that. Over the summer when our infection rates were really, really low, there was a push by some of those who were not able to fully participate, or their children weren't able to fully participate in remote learning because they have learning or physical disabilities, or for other reasons. And there wasn't, it didn't really take off that much. Summer school participation, there wasn't a state strategy to increase summer enrollment or expand the school year so that more students could get into the classroom when infection rates were low. So, it comes with a huge price tag doing something like that. And so, the state doesn't really have money to entice districts to do something. And I would venture to say districts don't necessarily have huge pockets of money sitting around to drastically expand their summer programming.
Jackie, what do you think the outgrowth of Connecticut losing its education commissioner to Washington is going to be? Miguel Cardona, of course, did not serve as the state's education commissioner for very long, frankly, before he took a job in the Biden administration, pending his actual acceptance of that job in a very complicated Washington political circumstance right now. But what do you think it means to Connecticut to lose Miguel Cardona right now?
So as far as policy goes, it's really hard to sort of lead huge reform efforts or huge pushes to do anything at an education level if you don't have an education commissioner. So there's that. But that doesn't mean that there aren't really great people over at the State Department of Ed who couldn't act as interim commissioners. How the process works is the State Board of Education recommends candidates to the governor to consider. Now, the governor's office, of course, is involved in who gets recommended to them. And so how quickly that means the state will have a new permanent education commissioner. I mean, if the past were to teach me anything, it typically takes about 8 to 9 months to have a new full-time education commissioner in place. But I mean, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they'll have someone tomorrow. But I do think that Miguel Cardona being tapped to become the U.S. Education Secretary does have ramifications for Connecticut, because he did have sort of his hands in a lot of different things that he was starting to get sort of ramped up. And, he didn't even make it through his first legislative session before it shut down because of COVID. And the governor's first legislative session, this is his third legislative session. He did, during his first legislative session, the governor didn't have an education commissioner either, and there weren't really huge initiatives that year either.
And Adria, one more question that's coming in from a bunch of people, and I know it's something I wanted to get to too. Of the many concerns of this past year in schooling and COVID times, people learning from home, the worry about special education students, people who have the most serious needs, and many parents, many advocates have said they just can't get the support that they need to learn in this remote way. Is there any sense that that's something that's going to be tackled or talked more about over the course of the next couple of months, ways to get more money into special education?
I think it goes back to the conversations that they're having, lawmakers and specifically the education committee are having right now. It's looking at making up for the lost education. I'm sorry to repeat myself, but that was something that was emphasized in a lot of these conversations. I know that that's something that's been a priority for the last year, looking at, with this pandemic, but for funding specifically, I haven't seen there be any commitments to, pushing any kind of initiatives or legislation for funding as of now. I think that when, the budget starts to roll out, we'll see we might see more legislation proposed. We could see more legislation proposed, but with the conversations that I have with the different committees that I've talked to, they just don't know what this budget's going to look like, and so they couldn't really give me a sense of what funding is going to look like, what kind of legislation they would propose for funding. And if you want to chime in on that too, Jackie.
Sure. So there is a push among various groups to increase funding for municipal aid for schools. That's going to be really hard given the state's eroding revenue that's happening right now. Right now, there is a heavy reliance on property tax to fund our schools. And so that disproportionately impacts communities that don't have a strong tax base, like your Hartfords or your New Havens. And so places like Hartford and New Haven are really looking to the state capitol to see if they're willing to increase aid. There is among, some religious and clergy members, they called on the governor to go above and beyond the $40 million that the state's education cost sharing formula would in fact pump into mostly those high need districts. But again, the state's facing a deficit, so nobody's making commitments of whether they're going to even fund the existing formula. During today's cost meeting, the Council of Small Towns, the governor was non-committal whether he will fund the additional ECS that was promised. And not for nothing, ECS is kind of like the political hot potato. Once it's been cooled for now, like there was a bipartisan legislative agreement that, we got it on an 8-year path. We're not going to, and I don't know if there's really the appetite to open up that can of worms again, because it's been resolved in a lot of people's mind. It's on a steady path for a $40 million a year increase. And so opening it up and reconsidering how it's funded that's a political animal right there.
Kelan, the last thing for you, a couple people were asking about the somewhat controversial police accountability laws that passed during the last legislative session, and whether or not there's going to be any attempt to strengthen some of those provisions, as some advocates and lawmakers have asked for, or pull back some of those, given the enormous amount of pushback that they've gotten from police and police unions.
I wouldn't be. I'm not sure that we're going to see a rollback at all. I mean, I think that the Judiciary Committee, Senator Winfield, is going to hold that pretty close to the chest and not allow that it to be rolled back at all. He told me the other day that they're not going back; they're moving forward. I would, however, expect there to be some perhaps changes to the Inspector General position. This is the special prosecutor who would be in charge of investigating and prosecuting deaths in police custody and in correction officers' custody in the Department of Correction. Over the summer, I think, maybe the fall, time has ceased to exist past year, but
all rolls together. Yeah.
Who knows anymore? This is the first time I've worn clothes in about a year. I don't even know if I did it right.
It looks great.
Thanks. The Criminal Justice Commission ended up sending 2 nominees over to the Judiciary Committee instead of 1. And so it's sort of a giant question mark hanging in the air as to what's going to happen. The big holdup is essentially that the prevailing belief right now is that they need to hire from within the existing pool of prosecutors in the state, as opposed to hiring outside and bringing in somebody like like my own hometown, like a Larry Krasner who was a longtime criminal defense attorney who became the district attorney in Philadelphia, bringing in an outsider to hold police accountable. I think you could see some changes there, but I wouldn't necessarily think about seeing a rollback. I get the sense that bill has been passed, and if anything, they'll build on it, not take it back at all.
Well, one other thing quickly, Kelan, we had talked before this event, and I know some people are really interested in changing some of Connecticut's voting laws to make it easier to vote by absentee ballot, et cetera. Is there some talk about new voting rules for people in prison?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. I'm very interested in this bill and this concept as a whole. There's some movement out of the Sentencing Commission to end felony disenfranchisement in Connecticut, and it would allow folks who are incarcerated to be able to cast a ballot, which means Connecticut has the most stringent felony disenfranchisement laws in the North, in New England, because they don't allow people who are on parole to vote. This would roll that back and also allow folks who are incarcerated to be able to cast a ballot. And the Department of Correction and the Sentencing Commission and volunteers have done some work on this in the past by going into the prisons. And I wrote a story on this over the summer, I think, and DOC connected me to their Office of Reentry, which I thought was interesting, and I think speaks to the idea that this is, whenever I talk about this to people, they say, like, don't people who are incarcerated have bigger things to worry about? And that's true, but at the same time, there's a degree of humanity that's restored to a person by giving them a voice in the process. And I think that for the Department of Correction to recognize that is notable in that they see as an important part of reentry. And so it'll be interesting to see the discussions about that, because even in the Sentencing Commission, it was an interesting discussion. They ended up sending it with a single carve out for individuals who are serving life without the possibility of parole. But it'll be interesting to see lawmakers and the Judiciary Committee, or the GAE, it's going to GAE, to talk about that, because it's an almost philosophical concept in a way as to who should lose the right to vote, and when should it be restored, and what does that right to vote say, and how does it restore a degree of humanity for folks who are incarcerated.
It's one of the many issues that we're going to be watching over the course of this legislative session. We got a lot of questions from people who are asking questions about taxing and budget. And I'll tell you what, we're going to have an event in a couple of weeks that'll probably get some of those questions answered. Keith Thaniff will be sitting down with me trying to explain the Connecticut state budget. So you should probably pop some popcorn for that one. That's our next event. I really want to thank our talented Connecticut Mirror reporters, Jacqueline Rabe Thomas, Kelan Lyons, and Adria Watson. Read them in the Connecticut Mirror at ctmirror.org. Thank you all so much for all of your work. Thank you for joining us tonight. If you are not yet a member of the Connecticut Mirror, you can support it. Go to that website, ctmirror.org, and just click on the little donate button, because every dollar that you spend on the Connecticut Mirror goes to help these reporters do their work. It helps to support independent, nonprofit journalism on all these very, very important issues. We do have an event coming up next week. We also have our podcast, Steady Habits. This program will be condensed somewhat and put out on our podcast in a couple of weeks. This week, we've got a really interesting conversation with Yale epidemiologist Greg Gonzalez as he talks about some of the ways that we can reform our health system so that we can better adapt for a pandemic next time it happens. Let's hope it doesn't. I want to thank you all once again for joining us. Thanks for supporting the Connecticut Mirror, and have a great night.